She said it as a joke. That is the first thing I want to be clear about. I said it the way you say something when you have noticed a pattern, but have decided the pattern cannot mean what it looks like, so you make it a joke to give everyone, including yourself, somewhere safe to stand. She laughed. Too quickly. And then she went very still in the way that told me the joke had landed closer to the truth than either of us had prepared for. That was a Thursday evening in November at 7:43, in an office that had been empty for 2 hours except for the two of us, which I was now understanding had been a pattern for 6 weeks, which I was now understanding might not have been a coincidence, which I was now standing at my desk pretending to look for a document while the air did something it had not done before. She said, "I have a lot of work." I said, "You always have a lot of work." She said, "So do you." I said, "I know." She said, "Then what are you suggesting, Marcus?" I said, "I'm not suggesting anything." She said, "You asked if I was following you." I said it as a joke." She said, "I know." She paused. She said, "Most jokes have a question inside them." My name is Marcus Webb. I am 32 years old. I work as a senior copywriter at a creative agency in the city, which means I spend my days choosing the exact right word for other people's ideas, which is either very useful training for what happened or evidence that I should have seen it coming much sooner. I am good at precision in language. I have, it turns out, significant blind spots in the area of my own situation. My boss was Elena Vasquez. She was 36. She had been the creative director of our team for 2 years before I joined it, which meant she had 3 years of institutional knowledge over me and the specific authority that comes from being the person who decides whether your work is good enough to show the client. She was the kind of leader who gave feedback precisely and without softening it past usefulness, who remembered the details of every project her team worked on, and who had the professional composure of someone who had learned early that a room takes its temperature from whoever is in charge. She had dark hair she wore pulled back during presentations and loose in the late evenings, which I had been observing for 6 weeks without calling it observing. She had a coffee mug that said nothing on it. No slogan, no logo, just a plain white mug she brought from home. I had noticed this early because everyone else in the office had some variation of a branded or ironic mug, and hers was just white. And when I had asked about it once, she had said, "I don't need my mug to have an opinion." I had thought about that for longer than the observation warranted. We had a professional relationship I would have described, before November, as excellent. Respectful, occasionally challenging in the productive way. She pushed my work harder than I pushed it myself, which I had found frustrating at first, and then had come to understand was the specific gift of someone who could see what you were capable of and refused to let you settle below it. I liked working for her. I had been careful to keep that clean and clear in my own accounting of things, the way you are careful when you are aware that an assessment could get complicated if you let it. And then, October happened. Specifically, the Alderton campaign, which required 3 weeks of late nights and delivered me into the habit of staying until 8 or 9, which I had expected to end when the campaign did. It did not end. I kept staying. And Elena, who had always been in the building when I arrived, and who I had assumed left at a reasonable hour, turned out to also still be there. Every time. Without comment from either of us. 6 weeks. I had noticed it at week 3 and filed it under coincidence. At week 5, I had stopped being able to file it under anything comfortable, and had started doing the thing where you decide not to examine something because examining it requires naming it. Then I made the joke on a Thursday in November, and she said, "Most jokes have a question inside them." I stood at my desk with a document I was not actually looking for, and I said, "What would the question be?" She said, "I think you know what the question would be." I said, "I'd like to hear your version." She said, Marcus. I said, Elena. She looked at me across the office in the particular way she had been looking at me for 6 weeks, that I had been translating into something it was not, because the correct translation required more courage than I had been ready for. She said, This is not appropriate. Professionally, I want to say that first. I said, I know. She said, I'm your direct manager. That's a real consideration, not a technicality. I said, I know that too, she said. And yet here we are at 7:43 on a Thursday, and I have been finding reasons to be in this building, when you're in it, for 6 weeks. Which is a thing I have not said out loud before now, and should probably have said to myself earlier, but I am saying it now, because you asked the question, even as a joke. And I cannot unknow that you asked it. Something in my chest did something that had no professional category. I said, you could have left. Any of those nights. You have a life outside this building. She said, I could have. She said it simply, the way you confirm a fact. She said, I chose not to. I said, why? She looked at her desk for a moment. She was holding the white mug, which was empty by this hour, which was also a thing I had noticed without meaning to. She said, because I have spent 3 years building something here that I'm proud of, and part of what I built is this team, and part of this team is you. And somewhere in the last year I stopped being able to cleanly separate those two things, and I have been trying to do the responsible thing, which is to keep them separate, and I have been largely unsuccessful, and staying late when you stay late is apparently what unsuccessful looks like in my case. I said, that's very honest. She said, it is more honest than I planned to be tonight. Yes, I said. I asked the question. She said, you asked it as a joke. I said Elena. I said her name the way she had said mine. Not a question, not a statement, the space between. I said, I have been staying late for 6 weeks because the work is there and also because you are here, and I have been telling myself the work is the reason, because the other reason required saying something I did not know how to say to my manager. She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something. Then she said, what would you say if I wasn't your manager? I said, I'd say I noticed the mug, the plain white one. I'd say I think about what you said about it more than makes sense. I'd say that when I finish a piece of work I'm proud of, you're the first person I want to show it to. And that started as professional respect, and at some point became something I didn't have a clean name for, and have been avoiding naming. She set the mug down on her desk. She said, this is complicated. I said, I know. She said, I'm not going to pretend it isn't. I said, I wouldn't want you to. She said, there are real structural things here. I am your manager. That does not disappear because it's inconvenient. I said, I know that. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. She said, what are you asking? I said, I'm not asking anything. I said, I made a joke and it turned into the honest version, and now we both know the honest version, and I think that is worth knowing, regardless of what comes from it. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, you're very careful with words when it matters. I said, occupational habit. She said, it's a good one. She picked up her coat from the back of her chair. She said, I'm going to go home tonight. I said, that seems right. She said, and you should too. I said, I will. She said, Marcus. She paused at her desk, coat in hand. She said, the question inside the joke. I don't have an answer that's simple or that doesn't require some thought about how things are structured. But I want you to know the question isn't. It's not unwelcome. I said, okay. She said, okay. She said good night and walked out, and I stood in the empty office for another 10 minutes looking at the white mug she had left on her desk, which was either an accident or wasn't, and I decided it did not matter which. I turned the lights off and went home. She moved me to a different reporting line in January. It was framed as a structural reorganization, which was also true. The team had grown, the reporting structure had been under review, and the change made sense on its own terms. She told me about it in a brief, professional conversation and did not mention November, and I said thank you and meant it. And after the conversation, she said quietly, as I was leaving, "This took some doing." I said, "I know." She said, "Worth it," and went back to her screen. We had dinner 2 weeks later. Not a work dinner, a restaurant she chose, a Friday evening. Both of us without the professional architecture between us for the first time, which turned out to feel less strange than I had expected, and more like something I had been waiting for without knowing the wait had a specific end. She was different without the authority layer, which is to say she was the same, but with different lighting. The precision was still there, the careful language, the way she listened in a manner that made you feel the thing you had said was worth having said. She ordered something and then reconsidered and changed her mind, which I had never seen her do in a work context, and which I found disproportionately endearing. She told me about her first job out of university, which had been in events management and had lasted 11 months, and had confirmed for her that she needed work where the thing she made was the point, not the scaffolding around someone else's point. I told her about the copywriting job I had taken at 23 that had required me to write product descriptions for industrial drainage equipment for 4 months, which had been character building in a way I had not appreciated at the time. She laughed at that, the real version, not the professional one, and said, "Did it help?" I said, "I can describe a drain with real emotional resonance." She said, "That is a niche skill." I said, "It has come up more than you'd think." She reached across the table at one point and took the bread I had been about to reach for, without asking, the way people do when they have stopped performing politeness and started just being in a room together. I let her have it. She noticed me noticing and said, "Too comfortable?" I said, "Not at all," and meant it. After dinner we walked for a while because neither of us was ready to call it a night, and she put her hands in her pockets against the cold. And at some point I said, "I'm glad you stayed late. All those times." She said, "So am I." I said, even though it was apparently a failure of professionalism. She said the professionalism was a separate issue. The staying was its own thing. I said, "What was the staying?" She stopped walking. She looked at me in the December light, which was colder and clearer than November had been. She said, "You really want me to say it?" I said, "I'd like to hear your version." She said, "Marcus." I said, "Elena." She said, "It was the same thing the joke was." She looked at me steadily. She said, "It was always the same thing." I said her name once, quietly, and she said, "I know." And I believed her. We kept walking. After a while I found her hand in the cold and she let me, and that was the end of the careful distance we had been maintaining for 6 weeks, and then several months on top of those. 6 months after the dinner she received a promotion, which moved her out of direct creative oversight into a more senior strategic role. She told me before it was announced and said, "This changes nothing structurally important between us." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm telling you because you should know, not because it changes what we are." I said, "I know that too." She said, "You're annoyingly good at this." I said, "Occupational habit." She said, "Stop saying that." I said, "Make me." She gave me the look she had stopped trying to make professional, which was the look I had first noticed in October, and had been thinking about ever since. A year and a half later, when people asked where we worked, we told them. When they asked if it had been complicated, she said, once. When they asked how we figured it out, I said, she stayed late. When they pressed for the full version, she said, he asked if I was following him, as a joke, and I laughed too fast, and we went from there. They always wanted to know if the joke was actually a joke. We gave different answers to that too. Nothing had changed where it mattered. She still gave feedback precisely and without softening it past usefulness. I still brought her the work I was proud of first. She still had the white mug, which now lived on my kitchen counter more days than hers. I still thought about what she had said about it. The only difference was that I had stopped filing any of it under categories that kept it at a distance. It had probably always been her. Staying late when I stayed late, white mug at her desk, the room taking its temperature from whoever was in charge. I just needed to make a bad joke on a Thursday in November to find out that the question inside it had been there all along, and so had the answer. What would you have done if you realized your boss had been staying late every night just to be in the same building as you, and you'd been doing exactly the same thing? And have you ever said something as a joke because you didn't have the courage to say it straight, and did someone take it seriously enough to give you the truth right back? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.